I'm going to do a quick introduction. So Dan Stanford from Visa. He joined Visa's risk organization in 2015 and currently leads Visa's global payment security strategy. In his role, he's focused on developing the future payment security roadmap for Visa, as well as the industry. Prior to this role, he worked in Visa's global corporate initiatives team, focused on innovation and payment security, including EMV, tokenization, and mobile payments. He was responsible for managing the US migration to EMV for Visa. Welcome, Dan. Great. And grab a seat, and I'll quickly introduce James, and then I'll give you guys a quick opportunity to do an introduction. So, James Devoy from Sysnet Global Solutions. James is Sysnet's Chief Security Officer and is also the head of their Global Risk and Assurance divisions. James joined Sysnet in 2011 and holds a management degree, which is supplemented by various risk and governance qualifications, including CISA, CRISC, and he has over 25 years' experience in information security, 8 of those within the PCI environment. Welcome, James. Great. Thanks very much, gentlemen, for joining me on the stage here. I'm just going to see, is there another mic that I could potentially... All right. Give us a second here. Well, I'll tell you what. Dan, why don't you give us a 5-minute intro? Just anything else you want to add to the intro?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Good morning. So as you mentioned, I've spent the last 3.5 years heads down migrating the US to EMV. And in October, I actually took a new role focused on our global payment security strategy. And the reason for that was really the fact that, we've spent the last couple decades around the world migrating markets around the world to chip technology to really do one thing, and that's to eliminate the risk of counterfeiting. But to the question we had in the earlier session, what we are starting to realize probably faster than we want is that as markets around the world move to EMV, all of the data compromise issues really move to the US. And one of the places where we dropped the ball looking at whether or not we should migrate the US to EMV was the fact that we really looked at it from a fraud perspective. And because the US, when we started 20 years ago on data security, we invested in an online always market, we were able to keep our fraud relatively low. But what ended up happening is every market around the world moved to chip technology, and so all the data compromises came to the US. Last year alone, 75% of all data compromises globally happened in the US. And that issue was exacerbated by the fact that we also have the largest merchants in the world, so it's the biggest opportunity for fraudsters. And the good news is now we've got the US down a path towards EMV. There's still a long runway. But what we're seeing is a lot of the data compromise issues are starting to come back to markets that maybe thought EMV solved this problem. And so in the last just year or two alone, we've started to see an increase in data compromises in the Middle East, in Asia Pacific, even here in South Africa. And so what we really need to do is focus on where do we want to go beyond EMV, and I think more importantly, where do we want to make our big bets? Because I think the challenges that we see from a security perspective is there's so much innovation happening today. We could stand up here and talk about geolocation, biometrics, tokenization, point-to-point encryption, 3D secure. I mean, the list goes on, but the reality is for anyone who's been part of a market that's migrated to chip, just doing that alone is an enormous investment for the ecosystem, for all of our clients. And so when we look at where do we want to go beyond that, we've got to be focused on what are those 2 or 3 things that we want to do as a global payment system to mitigate data compromise issues and to eliminate fraud in the CNP channel.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan. James.
Hi, good morning, everyone. First of all, I may require Andrew's translation services later. As you can probably guess, I'm not American or South African, but I come from the wonderful small nation of Scotland, which is currently part of the UK, which is still currently part of Europe. So if you require any translation services, Andrew's used to speaking to me, so I'm sure he can translate. From my perspective, I've been involved in PCI now for around about 8 or 9 years, roughly 1 year after it became mainstay. In fact, this year, in the PCI conference in Vegas in a month or two's time, is actually the 10th anniversary. So globally, it's been around now for a decade. And over that period of time, it's changed a lot. The very early days, no one knew what they were doing, being honest. QSAs, in those days I was a program manager. came from an information security, originally a technology background, 25 years ago changed to an information security background, and I was asked to go and look at something called PCI. No one knew what PCI was, even the people inside PCI. It was an ethos, it was an idea, it was something designed by the brand schemes to reduce fraud in that marketplace and make the world safer for us all. And over that period, it has changed a lot. I'm sure the guys will agree. We may only be on version 3.2 of the standard, but there's been a lot of change to mature that standard over that time. And we as an industry have been quite successful in reducing fraud. I don't know the exact figures, but when EMV came into the UK, overnight the fraud levels in that particular sphere dropped fantastically. I think it was like 95% drop overnight, basically, when EMV arrived. So fantastic success. But of course, as we've said, it drives the problem elsewhere. And there's some exciting things happening now. In this session, we're going to speak about a few of those. And what I'd like to do, my particular reason for being here, is I've been involved in a lot of that journey within Europe and the US. And I'm hoping to give you some insight on, A, being a program manager for about 3 to 4 years, actually helping large merchants become compliant, and then jumping the fence to being one of the QSAs and looking after a QSA company. So I can see the problems on both sides, how difficult it is for people to implement, but why they have to implement. And at the end of the day, these technologies, if we take away the card data, if we devalue card data, all the things that Larry spoke about, all of the protection that's in place doesn't matter greatly. From a PCI perspective, forget data perspective, it doesn't matter if someone gets through your firewall and gets the data if the PCI data is absolutely useless to them. So today we're going to talk about some methods of how we can try and achieve that goal. You still should be secure. It amazes me after all these years, the slides that Larry put up. I've seen those for 10 years. In fact, I've seen them for 25 years. Because long before PCI, there was still the same message. Secure your firewalls, change passwords, patch vulnerabilities. That's basic information security. And I still get despaired sometimes when I see that people aren't doing the most basic things. But today we're talking about how these technologies can help us not worry so much about that, but give us a position where the data is useless to the person who steals the data.
Great, thanks very much, James. Excellent. Okay, to kick the session off, let's digest the title, which is Removing Card Data with New Technologies. And I know both of you have actually mentioned some of these new types of technologies. Dan, do you want to maybe just take us through? I know you mentioned, you rattled off a bunch of names there. Maybe give us more of an idea around those, maybe prioritization. Give us your thoughts.
Yeah, sure. So from a removing and devaluing data, I mean, there's really two technologies that we talk about. There's tokenization, which is getting a lot of fanfare when you talk about all the different pays out there. And then there's point-to-point encryption. Our view on that is, point-to-point encryption, depending on what market you're in, is available today. Acquirers have sold it for many years. Terminal vendors all have solutions out there. It's just about education, it's about queuing issues, it's about everyone has a very long technology pipeline, and how do you get that prioritized over building an omni-commerce strategy. When we talk about, and it's reliant on merchants and acquirers to deploy that in a marketplace where you have 35 million merchants globally. But I do think it's got a place in the short to medium term. In the long term, our vision is we want to take merchants and acquirers out of the business of protecting payment card data. They don't want to be in that business. They've shown that, not all, but many are not good at doing it. And you talk about, some of the things that you mentioned in terms of trends, some of these things become an education gap. When you see a merchant the size of Target get compromised over some really basic data security, best practices, I think in the long term we want to just say let's get rid of any payment card data in any of those ecosystems. Everything should be a token, and we shouldn't have data being passed in the clear. The challenge becomes we can't be naive about how long of a roadmap that is. Right? We've given merchants access to the account number for 50 years, and they've built loyalty and returns and a whole business process around it. So if you're going to take that away from them, you have to make sure that you're not disrupting their businesses as part of that.
Great comments. James, in your view, we talk about new technologies. I know you've mentioned some of these. Dan's touched on those as well. From your perspective, is there a priority that you can place on those there?
Yeah, I certainly think so. Again, let me speak for the UK. So the UK has went through a number of emerging technologies. Of course, any emerging technology gets taken over by the next emerging technology. So if I was to look at some of the things we've talked about today, point-to-point encryption is probably the most fundamental one. I don't want to put myself and my business out of business. I don't want to get to a day when I can't do assessments and I can't do consultancy, because that's a crazy thing for me to be. But point-to-point encryption is something that can possibly do that. So I still have to embrace it, because of course at the end of the day it's about securing card data. We will go on and do something else when that market changes. So in the UK I'm already seeing that from you take my business perspective, I'm already seeing that the fees that we charge, I'm already seeing the vendors that have products out there having diminishing returns now, because people are devaluing the card data. And they've tried doing that with hashing, and they've tried doing that with masking, to all various levels of success. And then tokenization was the big thing, and still is to a certain extent the big thing in the past 2 or 3 years. But I wouldn't class that as quite emerging anymore. Tokenization has been around for a while now. As we said, there are a lot of good examples of where tokenization has really devalued the data. But point-to-point encryption is where we're going to. And it's like Dan said, it's getting towards that day when there is no card data, and therefore you don't have to worry about it, and my business has to find something else to do. So point-to-point encryption, I think, would be the answer to the question.
Great, thank you. All right, let's go into this a bit deeper now. So we're talking point-to-point, we're talking tokenization. Where, Dan, let's start with you. Where are we seeing these being implemented? I mean, are you seeing progress being made in the States, North America? Break those apart maybe a little bit, and let's see where we go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you just look at the two technologies fundamentally, I mean, the challenge with tokenization is if I'm a merchant who's sitting there concerned about data compromise, I have to have all of the transactions coming into my environment, or a good percentage of them, showing up as tokens. So I'm reliant on the rest of the ecosystem to actually deploy tokenization, or I have a pretty big vulnerability still sitting there. Whereas point-to-point encryption is the one thing that I can do today to eliminate that risk. And if you see what happened in the US with 2 of our major merchants having enormous breaches in the last few years, where CEOs, CMOs are getting fired, it's galvanized large merchants to look to deploy secure technologies such as point-to-point encryption. At the same time, in the earlier session we talked about the pizza shop analogy. You're actually seeing a lot of the small, level 4 merchants who are no longer even accessing data, where they're having a service provider who's just deploying and encrypting all data at the source. And a lot of that in the US was driven out of some major acquirer breaches that we had 5 or 6 years ago, where the acquirers just said, table stakes, my solution to the merchant offering is going to be an encryption solution. So you're seeing a lot of progress and momentum with the level 4 merchants. I mean, we estimate we've got over 1 million of our locations encrypted. And the large merchants, now that they've started to kind of finalize their EMV roadmap, are all looking to deploy point-to-point encryption in the first or in the next year or 2. The big vulnerability in the US is around the restaurants who are being managed by integrators and value-added resellers. Maybe they have 7 or 10 locations. They're not really aware of some of the breach risk until it's a reactive environment. They've already had a data compromise. And then if you look beyond the US, I think the challenge becomes there's been such a spotlight on the US and some of the vulnerabilities we've had over the last few years that we're almost going beyond where other markets are. And what you'll see is that fraud and data compromise are not local challenges. They're global phenomenons. And if you're seeing the US move to deploy secure technologies like point-to-point encryption and you're not, then you become a big risk in the ecosystem. So you've got to be making sure that you're at a level bar with everyone else.
Great. James, from your perspective, we talked a bit about tokenization and implementation of point-to-point in North America. What are you seeing around those two technologies in your region? And maybe you can comment a little bit about around the evolution of tokenization and point-to-point as standards.
Indeed. it's not a US problem. The US publish their data compromises. Europe doesn't. I'm not sure, the South African, do you have to publish here? No. So outside the US, there's very little published. So people keep thinking it all happens in America. It doesn't. It happens everywhere in the world. It's just of the legislation around publicising the breaches. So it's not just a US thing, and Dan mentioned US. Everyone has got the same issue. We're all experiencing the same problems. But let's go back into the question Andrew asked, tokenisation. In a risk-based environment, if you're a risk professional, one of the things you can do with risk is you can transfer risk. And one of the great things about P2P, which I'll come to again, is that you transfer that risk outside of your business. So let's first of all look at that evolution. When tokenisation came in, initially, tokenisation systems required you to have a vaulted solution, which basically meant you had a big dirty database full of every single credit card number you've ever dealt with. And that database had a reference to the token that was substituting the card number throughout your environment. But you still had what I used to call Fort Knox, or the red zone, the place that you really had to protect. So you as an organisation still had this problem. You still had a PCI problem. All 12 requirements still applied to the organisation, but maybe on a smaller part of the organisation rather than the whole environment. A kind of a segmentation solution to a certain extent. But you still had a lot to do. And then vaultless solutions came out, where vendors came up with solutions that enabled you not to have that database of translations. And that again helped a bunch of organisations reduce the requirements, the 12 requirements, and make it a little bit easier. But there still was a requirement to do as many controls as your environment ecosystem required. So people were still coming to us saying, this isn't a utopic situation, a solution. This is still something we have to work on. And then P2P came around. And P2P, when it first came out, was deemed to be the answer, the solution. But it was flawed. And I know we have a representative of one of the brands with us today, Dan, but I'm sure he'll admit it was flawed. There was a problem with it. The fundamental problem was it tied the merchant into an ecosystem. It was a total solution that meant you signed for a 3 or a 5 year deal. You could not change your acquirer, you couldn't change your payment processors, you couldn't change your POS machines, you couldn't change your pin-entry devices. You were tied into that environment. And that was realised. It was realised this was very difficult. And a lot of organisations found it a real struggle to bring together the relevant makers, service providers, manufacturers, to coherently come up with a solution. So version 2 of the standard has moved on now to being a componentized solution now, where you as a merchant, if you are a merchant, you can select the various people you want to deal with. You can select your facilitator, you can select your acquirer, you can select your pen devices, your POS devices, etc. You can build a solution now. So now what we're seeing, especially in Europe, is a much bigger adoption of P2P now, because the business side of the company isn't frightened of being tied into something now that they can possibly not get out of. So that to me is the kind of chronological timeline of tokenization moving into P2P.
Great, James, and I'm going to go straight back to you there. I'm just going to ask you the type of profile of a customer who's engaging on these P2P engagements in Europe. Can you give us a bit of a sense of what's going on there? Is it large guys, small guys, combination, acquirers?
Yeah, we're finding as it's maturing that it is moving down the way. It was the bigger guys first of all. It was the very large merchants. It's now moving down into the mom and pop shops now. We're finding more people putting together solutions that are based around in a box, a P2P in a box solution. In fact, in the UK, I won't mention names, I'm not allowed to with NDAs, but the acquiring community in the UK have certainly came up with lots of P2P in a box. In fact, you can go into a retail store now, John Lewis, if any of you are from this neck of the woods, you'll know that name. You can get to John Lewis now and buy a box off the shelf for a couple $100 or euros or pounds, whatever, got any value these days. And you can actually plug it in and basically have P2P running straight away inside your mom and pop shop.
Great, good to hear. Dan, comments from your side? Is it across the board? You're seeing folks looking at this aggressively, or is it starting further up the chain?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing more people looking at it. I mean, our adoption curve kind of was the reverse, probably, of the UK, where we had major data compromises at some of our acquirers, and then they just came up with out-of-the-box solutions. If you want to work with one of them, you're just going to have point-to-point encryption. And then you saw a lot of merchant interest coming out of the big data compromise events over the last few years. Unfortunately, what ended up happening is it just became a prioritization issue where they had to get to EMV. And so most of our large merchants have been focused on moving to EMV, and now that they have, they're focused on deploying encryption in the next probably year or two. Because they know that that risk is just enormous in terms of their brand, their reputation, and just the amount of data flowing through the ecosystem there.
Perfect. And I suppose just a comment from my side on that, and really want you guys to jump in afterwards. I think what we're seeing is an evolution of these technologies moving up the stack. I know, for example, both brands, or the major brands, are coming out with tokenization and point-to-point-esque solutions. Those are going to be trickling down as we see things moving forward. And I suppose that really resonates with the presentations we saw earlier about baking the security in, trying to devalue the card so that literally the merchant, or if they're large or small, it doesn't really matter because they're dealing with non-sensitive data. Do you see that as the future? I mean, is that where you think this is going to go? Obviously with the support, the foundation layer of the acquirers, the issuers, to provide that platform.
Indeed, well, I think Dan answered that question. I think Dan said, in his earlier comments that, there's a lot of movement, a lot of things were happening to get to that point where we don't have card data. And I think P2PE is a fundamental step in that process. As I said, it's now not only the big guys doing it, it's down now to the mom and pop shops. And that if we can get to that, position where there is no card data, from a PCI perspective, I keep adding, not from an information security perspective, because you've still got things like POPI to deal with and European data protection, etc. Nothing to do with this forum, nothing to do with us today, but I still think that, I think Dan answered the question, the technologies are moving that way that we get there.
Great.
Yeah, and I think I would just add, because we probably haven't spoken about this yet, is the education gap is enormous to really ever envision a world where every single merchant is doing point-to-point encryption. I'm not sure I see that. It's 35 million merchants today that you've got to get to deploy it, and many of them, it's not because they wouldn't, it's just the education gaps are huge, and there's a lot of sales efforts that go into it. I think what we'd really want to see long-term is actually where every transaction that shows up in their environment is already a token. Today that is the case anytime you tap a phone, with all the digital wallet solutions today that are using tokenization, but I think long-term we'd actually like to add tokenization onto the card form as well, because card-based payments aren't going away. And then from a merchant perspective, whether or not you're doing EMV, contactless on a card, or on a mobile device, every transaction coming into my environment is already a token. And therefore the merchants and acquirers don't have to make those investments in point-to-point encryption. But that is a long runway. That's just, we have to be real with ourselves. But that's where we see the future going long term. In the near term, the one thing you can do from a merchant's perspective to protect yourself is point-to-point encryption. So I think we'll absolutely see that accelerate because, again, tokenization has to happen at scale before I, as a merchant, can ever feel like I don't need to be encrypting data anymore.
Great. Okay, so we've got merchants, PSPs, and acquirers in the room. I imagine mostly from Southern Africa. What would they do next? Their message we've got, what they've taken away here is, yes, there is technology out there. They can do something. Where do they go next? I mean, maybe if we start at the merchant level and work our way upwards. James, your advice here?
You certainly have to do one of the, I think you have to do one of the technologies. You have to, if you've not tokenized, consider tokenization. If the market has enough P2P solutions available to you at the moment that you can buy into, seriously consider that. But even tokenization, there's a great thing happening across Europe now with tokenization as a service. So again, if you're a small merchant, maybe that's a solution, maybe that's a halfway house, maybe it's something to do until there's a good solution out there for you in the P2PE marketplace. I know that South Africa and the African nation is looking at P2P. I know you're starting to make inroads into that. I know some of the acquirers are starting to build solutions. But what I'm not sure of, Andrew, maybe you can give advice, is the market there for the merchant at the moment? Is there enough P2P solutions for them to choose from?
I think it's a great question, and I'm sure it'll come up from the audience at the end of the session. I think absolutely not. I think globally we know there's not enough point-to-point solutions out there, as certainly as much as we would like. Having said that, there's a huge amount of attention, and what we're certainly seeing is that folks are approaching it in a building block manner now with the new version of the standard, as you mentioned, James. So the good news is you can start embarking on this process in an organized fashion, in a methodological, I can't get that word right now, but if you can work on that process, build the fundamental building blocks, it'll stand you in great stead for arriving at a point-to-point encryption solution at some point in the future. Because again, even if you're doing the bare basics and the bare minimum, you will be devaluing card data. That's the important thing that we're trying to achieve. Dan, any comments from your side? Where would a merchant start?
I mean, I think given both of those comments already, what I would say is, like, a starting thing that you can do tomorrow is make sure that any administrator, any vendor coming in that has access to your database is using two-factor authentication. I mean, if you're seeing the data compromises where they're getting into the merchants today, a lot of times it's just that there's not good best practices around data security, and that they're using a static username that they're giving some airvac vendor, and they're getting into these massive databases because they're not using two-factor verification to get in. That's something you can do today, and you're not reliant on other parties. Just build it into your own ecosystem.
Absolutely, I think that's a great comment. I mean, if we think, we've talked about the long roadmap to get to the nirvana of devalued payments, but there's a lot you can do from a data security perspective. You know, forget PCI for this point in time. Let's make sure that systems are secure, and anyone getting in won't. Well, if we can really establish a hard out-of-shell layered security, it'll stand us in great stead from stopping those regular attacks and compromises we're seeing right now. Good. Okay. Unless there are any final comments from you gents, I was going to open this up to the floor. We've got about 7 minutes left of the session. Any final comments from you guys before we open it up? Or should we make this interactive?
Quite happy with that.
Great. All right. Well, let's see. Any questions out there? I'm sure there must be questions, comments, challenges. Mr. Muton over there. Oh, hang on for the mic, Paul.
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm from Technologies, Credit. I just got a couple of questions. Obviously, we're quite familiar with P2P and PCI and those kind of things. The kind of questions I have basically is, how far away do you see the on-card tokenization being away? Because clearly, gentlemen, this whole industry is being built around securing much infrastructure that could have been avoided if the cards that EV-based is producing tokens today. So I think it'll be a lot of criticisms being put to the industry as saying it's building solutions that's actually servicing the card brands rather than the merchant base out there. So I think that would typically be one approach, is to produce EMV standards or capabilities that basically generate devalued card data from the word go.
Yeah, it's a great question. So obviously we already have network tokenization that's being rolled out around the world in a number of markets. I think we just recently launched it here in South Africa. The ability to actually tokenize a card-based payment, we could do today. We have a token vault. It's a pretty easy process. Hold on a second. I know where your mind's going. From an issuer perspective, right? I could partner with an issuer today, and it would be pretty easy for my team to actually deploy tokenization like we have on digital devices. The challenge is when you introduce it on a card factor, then it happens overnight at scale, and you have to go back to, you would break a number of different merchant environments because of how they use the account number that they've had access to for many years. So we're working on solutions for how merchants can still track consumers without using the account number. And until we can roll that out and have that go throughout the ecosystem, we really can't deploy card-based tokenization at scale. because you have many challenges. For instance, I buy something online, I go to return it in a store, and I bought it online using a token, and I'm returning it now with a different token or account number, and the system breaks down. So you have to build out the ability to track across omnicommerce without using the account number, which is how merchants do it today.
Sorry, I understand that, but what I would suggest is you typically could still use a card number as you do today, but just augment it with additional data that you can't transact with without it being present. For instance, additional security tokens that augment the card data that would basically fulfill that same role. So you'd still have the original card number at the merchant's disposal for those cases that want to make use of it, but that card number is not potent anymore in terms of it's not usable in a card not present environment for transaction-based use.
Yeah, I mean, that's where we're going.
Okay.
Today, many merchants use the account number, so we just have to be cognizant of the way that they operate their business. So we're trying to find a replacement for them through EMVCo and through some new standards to create something called a payment account reference that allows them to still manage their business without using the account number. But until that can get deployed through the system, we can't really tokenize the ecosystem at scale.
I think you've got to also think
Thanks.
about the whole environment. So taking from a QSA perspective, one of the problems we have as QSAs, and Andrew will confirm as being a QSA company, is when we go to the merchants, when we go to the people that are taking the payments, they have lots of developed systems. They have developed their own internal processes, methodologies, but especially IT systems. And a lot of those IT systems, we find they've got card data in them. And of course, we have to help them remove that card data because it will fail PCI assessment in 9 times out of 10. The timelines for doing that sometimes, I've got merchants saying to me, I can't do that, James. It's a $50 million project. It'll take me 10 years to do this. We're the QSA for the largest retailer in the world. And I won't talk about what they do because they're actually very, very good at what they do. But you imagine someone like that across the globe, a global retailer, all of a sudden having to change all of their infrastructure to cope with a different format token or to cope with something totally different than they've spent all these years doing. It's very, very difficult. So it's not the brands. The brands have technologies now. It's the globe. It's the size of the scale of the problem. It's a huge problem. And I think it can only be an iterative approach to get there. Let's use tools and technologies that we've got currently available. Let's move away into a tokenized world, and then let's roll these things out probably by markets. I travel the world. I need my card to work wherever I go. I don't want to have a card that only works in the UK and I need to use something else for the States and something else for Zimbabwe and something else for Ghana. It's not going to make me very happy as a consumer. So there's a massive problem. But the brands are working on it, but it'll take a while for that to happen. It was expensive for what, sorry? Well, is it expensive? Where are you looking at the cost? So again, when I do cost benefits analysis, I'm looking at a merchant who says that every day. It's the same question from every merchant. This is really expensive. And I say, okay, well, let's forget for a minute what will happen if you get breached, because that will cost you some money. Yeah, so let's forget that even for a second. Now let's look at your other costs that you're going to do by not introducing something like P2PE, for instance. You're going to have to buy log management systems to capture all the logs. You're going to have people who are expensive to look at those logs and to check for vulnerabilities and problems that are happening. You're going to have to build patching systems and methodologies. You're going to have annual training. So the list goes on of all the things you have to do if you can't devalue that card data. So it's not a simple answer. It may look like a big chunk of money to buy a P2P or a tokenization as a service or whatever it might be. But let's look at the holistic cost of that. And then let's think of what happens when you do get breached. You have to become Larry was speaking about it, you have to become a level 1 merchant. You have to give Andrew's company tons of money to come along and do a forensic investigation. Yeah? You have to have people crawling all over your systems for a period of time. You go on observation lists. You've got reputational damage, all the costs of breach. So it's not as simple as, hey, it's going to cost me X to buy P2PE. Think of that holistic problem you have as a business, and is it worth it? Many things in my personal life I now outsource. It's no longer worth the time to do X, Y, Z because I'm looking at the whole position. You know, is it worth just giving that to someone else? You know, and that's what you've got to look at is the benefit from that spend, not just the bottom line figure. I hope that answers the question. It's not that expensive in the scheme of things.
Great, okay, ladies and gents, I think that's a wrap. I think all that remains is to say a big thank you to both of our speakers. Great presentation. Hope that resonated with some of you and it made some sense. So Dan, a small token of our appreciation. Thank you. Here we go. Cheers, that's for you. And one for you there, James. Here we go. Great, and a quick round of applause to say thanks to our guys.